The snowfall had become relentless. Howling winds whirled snowflakes about in a dizzying frenzy. Never before had Rise witnessed such a violent storm. It was as if nature itself sought retribution against the mountain for its long defiance. No longer could he brave the gales, as his strength to resist the turbulence was far too little. Worse still, should the snow get his clothes wet, in these conditions his journey would come to a bitter end. The night had already seen most of the feeling driven from his extremities, and to make matters worse, his food stock was nearly depleted. It was now a race against time if Rise wished to ever see the light of day again. All was not lost, however. In spite of the grim situation, Rise had been able to keep his wits about him. Though he was low, the fruit was a steady supply of energy that had reinvigorated his mind and body countless times by now. While rare, the moon had peeked from behind winter's shroud several times, and despite his failed attempts to locate Mailer, he had spotted what appeared to be the passage Kaysen had led him on. Despite the cumbersome trail and the elements, the further he traveled, the less steep his path had become. While it was quite treacherous, he was relieved that his present route provided many buffers against the storm's wrath. Rise knew that he was close to the secret passage, but the moon had been absent for some time now, leaving him to rely on the mountainside to guide his steps. Warily the boy wove through the narrow route, yearning for light. The bitter sting of night drained his vitality and caused his heart to falter. He knew, with how little food there was left, he should abstain for as long as possible, but his body rebelled against his will, crying out for any reprieve from the night's oppression. Ahead he could sense whipping winds, just beyond the jagged outcrop he was sheltering behind. Soon his bulwark would forsake him, and once more he would be forced to brave the storm in all its fury. Pausing for a moment, he huddled beneath the ridge and bundled himself in his baggy cloak. Digging into the folds of his mantle, he plucked a fruit from his pocket before chomping down on the fleshy bulb. A small burst of warmth enveloped him as he wolfed down the sappy meat, relieving the cold's bitter sting. After he finished off his ration, he decided to take a moment to gather his strength. Without continuous movement, it proved difficult to keep the cold at bay even for a moment. But he had no choice, so huddled against the icy stone, Rise waited for his strength to return. It had been a battle all day, and long into the night at this point, with no end in sight. Each passing moment reinforced the fact that he could not afford to stay still for long, but each time he thought to rise, his body demanded another moment of peace. To justify his inaction, he told himself, in the darkness it would be all too easy to miss the passage to Mailer. He needed the moon, but looking up into the sky, he could not see a chink in the impenetrable gloom of night. Winter had only just arrived, and yet he was weary of it already. The cold, a full stomach, and his weariness conspired against the boy, making his eyelids flutter. He just needed one more moment. Rise's eyes were a hair's breadth from being shut forever, when his heart skipped a beat, and vigor surged within his body once more. There, sitting with a dusting of snow, the haggard boy was awash in heavenly light. The moon finally broke the tempest veil, bathing the mountain in its haunting pale light, if only for a few fleeting moments. Rise bolted up from his seat and rushed to catch a glimpse of the path, to see how far he was from the secret passage. Scampering toward the ledge, the boy surveyed the barren summit. Blasted by wind and snow, his wide eyes absorbed every detail of the mountain. Immediately, Rise's heart sank. He was indeed close. Below him lay the unmistakable meandering ravine that had led him to Mailer, several hundred hands beneath his feet. Staring down at the gulf, the moon's light vanished, perhaps never to be seen again. Staggered, Rise stumbled back from the ledge and slumped against the mountain's bulwark, his mind racing. Should he continue on his present course, he would be taken deeper into the mountain with no guarantee of finding a path to Malur. Pressed against the sheer wall of the mountain's face, Rise strained every ounce of his mental capacity to recall the path he had taken, and in his mind's eye he retraced his steps. However, no matter how hard he tried, he could not say for certain there was another path available to him, let alone one that could take him to the passage below. He could retrace his steps and risk the pitfalls that had plagued him to this point, or he could press on and pray that the path somehow led to Malur. Both plans would see him waste countless hours searching for a path in the darkness. Hours that he did not have. He could not afford to hesitate. He must be bold. The gale's strength rose, the storm's many voices wailing as the baleful shadows cloaking the mountain waited on his demise with gleeful anticipation. Rising to his feet, the boy felt the wind pawing at his mantle, whipping it wildly about him. It was as if ice water flowed through his veins in lieu of blood. Mustering his courage, the boy looked down into the inky void beneath him. Taking a sharp, deep breath, Rise turned his gaze to the night sky. The clouds above thundered across the heavens like a torrent from the river Chandra, overflowing her banks in spring. Below, the flurries swarmed, pelting the barren summit and adorning it after the manner of its kin. The boy approached the ledge, his stomach twisting into a knot. Turning to face the mountain, his throat went dry as the storm whirled about its dark spire. If this was to be his end, then at least he would meet it on his own terms. His breath caught in his throat as he stepped from solid ground. Suspended between two starless voids, Rise plummeted towards the earth. Sudden fear seized his heart as the ledge rushed past his face. However, his body instinctively sought to regain control of his freefall. Clawing at the sheer stone with hands and feet, he fell unhindered through the air. Each second was dreadfully elongated, yet bore an abruptness that incited sheer panic. Suddenly, the curvature of the mountain sloped under Rise's feet, causing his rigid limbs to buckle painfully. His hands and knees crashed and skid against the harsh stone face as the balls of his feet ground into the unforgiving stone. With all of his might he struggled against the rapid onslaught of the mountain to maintain his balance and prevent himself from tumbling. Though these efforts proved to be in vain, for in an instant the mountain disappeared in front of his outstretched limbs, only to return crashing inward steeply. Rise collided hard against the slope, sending a jolt through his whole body, whipping his head against the stone. Though only a glancing blow, the boy was dazed and lost all semblance of control. Tumbling violently down the mountainside, he clutched his head in his arms, absorbing the blows raining down upon him as he toppled helplessly down the slope. Pain racked the boy's body, shooting through his ribs and shoulders with each collision. He held on for all he was worth, till the fury of his fall relented for a moment, and Rise found himself skidding down the slope on his back. Madly the boy dug his heels and forearms into the snow-covered ground, slowing his momentum. Blind and groggy, Rise struggled to gain control, but he had only enough time to pivot his feet in front of him before the ground vanished beneath him once more. The moment Rise felt himself begin to fall, the whole world stood still. He had only a moment to react, but in an instant the boy snapped about, latching to the ledge of the mountain, clinging to dear life, his hands clawing at the cracks in the ledge's cold lips, issuing a wave of agony that ripped through his hands, arms, and shoulders, yet he refused to surrender his hold on the mountain. Having stopped his momentum, he frantically sought for the cliff with his feet, and was rewarded when his toes scraped against the stone. Swiftly planting them firmly against the slope, he clung to the ledge with all of his might. Rise remained completely still, hanging on the ledge, not daring to even breathe. His head rang and his thoughts were slow and nonsensical as he attempted to piece together what had happened. After a long moment, the boy gasped for air as seemingly hundreds of gashes and bruises announced their presence. Any other time in his life, such pain would have caused Rise's grip to slip, but the boy's hands were clamped so firmly to the ledge that for a time, even he could not have willed himself to let go. With tremendous effort, Rise heaved himself onto the ledge, gritting his teeth through the pain before collapsing in a ragged heap onto the snowy ledge. He lay in the snow's bitter embrace for some time, silently witnessing the gale's onslaught swarm overhead. Winter's bite tore at his tender wounds and would not allow him even a moment of peace. It took all of his effort to breathe as each labored breath set his ribs ablaze and racked his body. But morbid curiosity spurred him to action. Shakily he raised his hand to his head and felt the already congealing blood caking his brow. His skull throbbed, but he doubted the injury was life-threatening. Gradually his mind turned to his other injuries. Not yet daring to move, Rise mentally examined his wounds. Scrapes and bruises were plentiful, but his cloak in the snow seemed to have buffered him from most external injuries. However, lying face up, he could feel a sappy wetness gumming his rags to his back. He could not feel a laceration, but he needed to be certain. In spite of himself, Rise gingerly sat up, his body lashing out with agitated protests at each movement. Carefully he slipped his icy hand under his jerkin and touched the area in question, searching for a wound. When he could find nothing, he removed his hand and brought his fingertips to his mouth. A sigh of relief escaped his lips as he tasted the tart flavor of the strange fruit. Sinking back to the ground, a mirthless chuckle escaped his lips. The storm had dried. With all of its malice, its cruelty and cunning, it conspired with the mountain to destroy him, yet he remained. Against all odds, he now stood atop the very same path that had led him and his uncle to all of this despair. There was no misfortune nor sorrow that could prevail against him. He had come too far. What lay at the end of his journey, he did not know, nor did he care. Neville Abio, nor the vermin of Malor, nor any huntsman sent to claim his head were of any concern. He was going to make it off this blasted mountain, if it was the last thing he did. Once he had railed against the storm to his heart's content. He set his jaw and willed himself to his feet. The soreness that seemingly enveloped the entirety of his body robbed most of Rise's newfound bravado. But the flame kindled within his spirit could not be wholly extinguished. It was only then that Rise realized the callus was missing. Cursing his misfortune, he set about looking for the blade. Anxiously he skirted along the cliff's face, pondering all the possible fates of the fine sword. The inky darkness made it nearly impossible to search for, and there was no hope of him knowing what had become of the blade during the fall. But surely it could not be too far. It would be such a pity to have carried it so great a distance, only to lose it now. For some time, he searched with no success, and had nearly decided to cut his losses out of frustration, when he stumbled upon it, resting a hand's length deep in solid rock, as if the unyielding mountain stone had been mud. So relieved was he that the boy plucked the sword from the ground without a second thought. His spirit swelled to the point that he started to trot down the path, with the sword in hand, his speed gated only by his green wounds. However, after a short scamper, Rise calmed himself enough to stop long enough to lash the sword to his back with the remnants of the tattered handmade sheath. With the callus strapped precariously to his back once more, Rise set off, his spirits soaring. Long after his adrenaline was spent, and he was forced to face the arduous path by his own strength, Rise's mind continued to conjure flights of fancy. Visions of a warm hearth, with a mug of hot grog thickening his blood, had him in a virtual paradise. Turning his shoulder into the wind, he knew there was nothing left but to keep moving. The only task left for the battered boy was to make it into Malor. If he could get past the night watch, there would be nothing between him and two charming ladies stripping over themselves to pamper him. The mere thought of Ashe fussing over him lent his The mere thought of Ashe fussing over him lent speed to his feet and fervor to his body. So down the winding path he plodded, attempting to drive some machination into Mailer, should a guard be foolish enough to remain at his post during such a gale. Though the boy had disregarded the storm in favor of conniving a means of his entry into Mailer, for its part, the gale was far from done with those who had dared trespass on the mountain ridge. Each step saw the howling winds bring more snow. Sometimes great sheets of the frigid accumulation would fall from off the mountainside onto the path, occasionally striking rise. The Barren Summit groaned under the fury of the storm's wrath as the winter's herald neared the zenith of its power. Together the haunting wails of the mountain and the wind's chilling slashes threatened the young interloper as he marched toward the forbidden village. Yet for all the mountain's protest, the boy continued onward, unperturbed by any hurdle thrown in his path. As the gale reached its crescendo, and the mountain bellowed its answer, there came a sound greater than thunder that shook the very foundation of the ancient landmark. At the resonance of this monstrous duet, even Rise faltered and took refuge in the shadow of the mountain. For a long while the mountainside reverberated with the sound of the distant calamity, causing the boy to marvel at the might of the winter gale. Never before had he seen a storm command such ferocity. However, even this spectacle could not long detain Rise. Indeed, he grew emboldened as he reasoned. There could not be a man so irresolute or foolhardy enough to contend with such a tempest. From the shadow of the stone he emerged to brave the storm once more. As he ascended the path, the mountain's howl grew more desperate, even as its hold on the boy slipped. The winds blasted down from the mount, but each moment they grew lighter. Snow still whirled about by unseen currents, but the tempest's bitter sting could not long deter him. The wind howled and chased the snow down the mountain, but was no longer incensed. In its stead was a melancholy whistle that sent chills up the boy's spine. On occasion the mountain groaned under the storm's barrage, but soon it grew silent. The world was no longer abuzz with the tempest's fury. Instead there was stillness, save for the gusts carrying the gale to the wider world. It became so oddly quiet, their eyes wondered if the storm had been enchanted. The path became increasingly familiar to him, in spite of the thick layers of snow concealing the contours of the passage. He was so close, but as he neared the next leg of the journey, new concerns arose to vex his spirit. The storm leaving was both a blessing and a curse. During the full wrath of the storm, Rise had no doubt the night watch would have abandoned their post. But now, as unlikely as it seemed, there was a chance the bandit captain would send someone to watch the pass. With what remaining strength he possessed, Rise pressed on. Into the early morning, it was not long before he had to proceed with caution. The boy was painfully aware of the scouts and their vantage. As he approached the spot where he and his uncle had been confronted, Rise clung to the walls of the ravine, staying low and in the shadows. His ears keenly sought for any signs of life as his approach slowed to a crawl. Rise strained his senses to their limit, ceasing to even breathe. Still, all he could hear over the whispering winds of the gale was the steady beating of his heart. The watch had most likely retired long ago, yet he remained wary. To be caught was certain death, yet to remain as he was brought no safety. Steeling himself for a final time, Rise crept with all the craft at his disposal, before forsaking the shadows and darting quickly to the ledge. Upon reaching the lip under the outpost, his blood froze as the wind wailed a mournful cry. Calming his racing heart, The boy held his breath to still his ragged breathing before venturing a glimpse at the bandit's station. Slowly he rose to his full height. With his body pressed against the cold stone, Rise peered over the ledge, his eyes straining against the darkness. After a few moments of investigating, a gasp escaped his lips. To his relief, the outpost was unmanned. However, it was plain to see, even under the oppression of twilight, there was something terribly wrong. Stepping up onto the watchman's encampment, his heart beating loudly against the low hum of the winter gale, the boy cautiously surveyed his new vantage. Under his feet he could no longer see stone peeking out from under the carpet of snow. The encampment and the path leading to Mailer were piled with a dense blanket of snow, so much so that if he continued, he would be forced to forego any semblance of stealth and bull his way through the path.